Is this the intro? Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today, and for waiting for us to make sure that everything was working properly. Welcome to our third ODX webinar. If this is your first time here, Kelsey and I just wanted to thank you for joining us and let you know that we generally do these about once a month, maybe every 6 weeks over the holidays. So in general, if you work for a company or a government organization that does something with open data and think you have some interesting lessons to share about using open data, please let us know as well. We're always looking for exciting new speakers. We're lucky today to have Brian Smith from Think Data Works to talk a bit about some of the challenges that that one has in sourcing open data and how you overcome it. Just a quick agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about what ODX is and our mission for those of you that aren't familiar. Brian's going to talk for a little while about their experience at Think Data Works in terms of sourcing open data. We'll try and save Q&A till the end this time because we find that makes moderation a little bit easier. And we'll also point you to the archive of this webinar, which will be available usually an hour or so after the webinar is complete. And we'll invite you to sign up for the next webinar as well, which will be towards the end of January. So I'm Joseph, Data Executive in Residence at Canada's Open Data Exchange. And I just realized we didn't put our names on the slide. And I'm joined here in Kitchener with Kelsey Veer, who's our Digital Marketing Coordinator, who has done all the awesome work of getting this set up and lining up speakers, which has made us super happy. Last I checked, we had about 55 people joining us today, which is fantastic. For those of you who aren't aware, ODX is a public-private partnership based out of Communitech here in the Waterloo region with a mission to support the creation of companies, jobs, and wealth through the commercial use of open data. We began operations in May of 2015. We are funded in large part by the federal government and also by our corporate funding partners that include D2L and OpenText. Joining us today is Brian Smith from Think Data Works. We're super happy to have him. Brian is an entrepreneur who very successfully made the transition from the Government of Canada, where he had worked on open data policy with the Treasury Board, and has been very successful with Think Data Works, which I will let him go ahead and describe to you now. So Brian, if you give me 1 sec, we'll flip over to your screen and off we go.
Great.
As I struggle with Windows.
That's fair. Can you guys, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine, yeah.
Great. I think there's a few problems switching through the slides there. I couldn't see them, so I'm going to try. And if anyone has any problems, just drop a comment on the side and we'll try and fix it. So I've got to do a screen share now. Share. Okay, great. Can you see the slide deck?
No, 1 sec. I think I'm just looking at the wrong window here. Oh, there we go. All right.
Okay, great. I can't see comments, so Joseph, if anyone says they can't see it, just yell at me to stop and I'll see what I can do. So thanks, everyone. Really great to have so many people join the call today. A lot of familiar names and a lot of new ones as well. So that's always a fantastic mix. The plan is I'm going to go over Think Data Works at a high level, walk through a few of the problems that we face using open data, as well as some of the problems that we create, or some of the solutions we create for our clients to adopt open data. At the end of the day, what Think Data Works does is we connect data to people who want to use it. And that's a much larger gap than I think a lot of people realize. And that's sort of where we found our marketplace. So I'll walk through that at a high level, and then really interested in the Q&A portion of the meeting to find who's on the call and what sort of problems they're facing and whether we can help. So the biggest problem that we're addressing with our clients are usually larger enterprise clients. We work with companies of all sizes, but mostly we see the companies that are capable of adopting open data, at least at large scale, are large enterprises like big financial institutions, companies that have sophisticated data shops, because they're doing a lot of work on cleaning and standardizing their own internal data, and they're looking for ways to augment that information with new sources of data to give them a competitive advantage, to find new information about particular client sets, all that sort of stuff. So one of the things that we talk to them about is this concept of the data not invented here problem, which is with the amount of public data that's being released, these days it seems exponentially growing every day. Data that's actually created and maintained outside of a company's environment is actually becoming more important and more high value than the data they can source from internal sources. This is often we get a sticker shock when we bring this up, but if you put yourselves in the shoes of a bank has really great data on their clients, but they are missing data on not their clients, which if you're a salesperson at the bank in the commercial banking sector, you're actually more interested in what other businesses are doing, not just particularly your clients. So if there's sources of information out there that can provide information on what those companies are interested in and where they are in the marketplace, that's actually more valuable than the data they can source from internal sources, which is things that they've already closed, clients they've already closed.
So Brian, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to make sure, is anyone else, so Payam, I see you're having trouble seeing the slides. Is anyone else having difficulty seeing the slides? Okay. All right, sorry about that. Go ahead.
So we're good?
I think mostly we're good, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try presentation again. Okay. Let me know if there's a problem. So data not invented here problem. Here's a quick example of a company that I think used open data really well. And this is Red Roof Inn. Most people would know them as a discount hotel chain or motel chain. Red Roof competes with Hilton, Sheraton's, all that sort of stuff, particularly around airports, but they don't have the ad budget to actually go head-to-head with the larger organizations. So they looked at open data as a way to actually gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace, and what they used was weather data and flight cancellation data, and they targeted basically people who were stuck at airports, and they increased their Google ad budgets for those particular areas and increased their conversion rates on searches by 375%. And I think this is a really great example of how two extremely simple open data sets can completely change the operations of a company. If Red Roof went traditional and just focused on either people who have been to Red Roofs before or sort of painted the market equally, they would lose every time to the larger guys. But using open data, they found a competitive advantage. And these are the sorts of things that we're finding larger companies are very interested in and are creating the largest value for companies who actually have the ability to bring open data into their environment. This is a stat we like to refer to. Gartner published it not too long ago. It basically said that 80% of organizations will be incorporating open data sources into their analytics solutions by 2017. As we enter December 2016, I think it's fair to say that this actually didn't happen. And really, it's for us, it's actually very fascinating to understand why it didn't happen, because the value of open data is there. Companies definitely now understand what open data is, which wasn't the case 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But still, the actual adoption rates are lower than expected. So why didn't this come true? For us, when we look at the issue, we call it the data divide. And really, what is happening, at least what we're seeing, is as more and more people are publishing open data, they make it available, and they publish it in multiple varying formats all over the place. The people on the other side actually don't know where to find it, or don't have access to the data in a format that they can easily plug into how they organize data internally, which creates a huge gap between providers and suppliers and people who want to plug into it. And this is sort of the gap that I don't think either side is actually responsible to solve. It's actually just a portion of the market that needs to be filled up with companies that are willing to do this work, or service providers that can actually go in and pick up the pieces and connect data to a user in a way that is relevant to their business, or to their app, or to the problem that they're trying to solve. So now the shameless plug portion of the presentation. This is what we originally built with our Namara platform. And one of the problems we set out to solve was just the problem of actually finding and accessing all available open data. So we originally built a search engine that connected to all the available open data portals across Canada and the US. And to this date, that's what we've built. It's obviously gone through iteration since we originally launched it, but at the end of the day, what Namara does for our users is it gives them the ability to find and access any available open data, and it's being constantly updated from the source. So currently we connect to well over 1,000 sources across Canada and the US. I think we're sitting on about 150,000 data sets at this point. And what our users can do is search that entire database. They can search it by source, or they can search it by category. And they can basically collect data into collections or projects that they can then use to either plug into their models, into building new apps. We do a lot of hackathons with a lot of different companies that create specified collections that fuel their hackathon in some sort of way. So that's more or less what Namara does. And I think the real problem that it solves is finding and accessing, which were two significant things that we saw as barriers to people actually finding and using open data. So really the problem that companies were facing was, one, they had no idea where to find data. And they didn't know how governments were, or which governments were responsible for actually publishing it. So in Canada, we've got municipal, province, federal. The average company that we spoke to, or the average data scientist in a company that we spoke to, actually didn't know that the province was going to be publishing health data and education data. They just assumed that was going to come from the federal open data portal, because the federal data portal was, the largest one. They didn't really understand that there'd be such a significant breakdown between the different municipalities, especially if we take Toronto as an example. Toronto, York Region, Mississauga, all these sorts of things. If you look, something as simple as trying to solve a traffic issue in the city of Toronto, spans across potentially 10 different jurisdictions. And in order to look at the picture from a macro perspective, all of those 10 municipalities or jurisdictions would have to be publishing like-minded data in order to actually solve the problem. So that was one of the biggest barriers that we helped companies get over. The second one was formatting. Even if organizations or governments were publishing similar data, oftentimes they do it in different formats. And this was just a silly barrier that was really tough for people to get over, because it takes a unified system to actually create a standard in order to digest it and keep it updated. And the last thing, and probably the most specific, was the licensing issue. So this is something we didn't think was going to be a large issue, but not having a clear license on a particular data set was actually a huge barrier for larger companies to adopt open data. So those who are familiar with open data portals, it's not always clear what license is attached to a data set or to the portal as a whole. And large companies, if we're talking about the banks or other sort of national or multinational organizations, if they didn't have a clear vision of what the license to the data allowed them to do, so whether it was a commercial, non-commercial, share alike, all that sort of stuff, the risk of actually adopting the data without having a legal opinion on whether they could use it or not was far too high for them to take, and they'd opt out to just not using open data altogether. So what we did for our enterprise clients is we started mapping to licenses and then building license equivalents into the platform so that organizations could filter out non-commercial licenses, could filter out share alike, could filter out attribution, although they all like that anyways, and giving them a list of data sets with licenses that they could actually use. And this was a big barrier that we broke that really helped a lot of organizations get over the hump of actually adopting and building open data into their products and solutions. So once we started doing that and working with clients firsthand, we kind of noticed something. One, it was definitely important for the organizations to find high value external data sources and bring them into their environment. But it was also just as important for them to take that data and mix it in with their own corporate sources. And that was a barrier that we weren't helping them with. We were giving them sort of just access to data, and they were plugging into it, and that was great. But really, each organization we came across had a different internal standard for how they wanted to adopt the data and how they wanted to use it. And that was a piece of the puzzle that we were originally missing, and one that was also just stopping a larger adoption of open data as a whole. So to go through an example of sort of what I'm talking about in this particular case, a good example is schools data. In this case, I'm using San Francisco, US data as a whole, but governments are pretty good at publishing points of interest data. Schools, often all governments, one of the low-hanging fruit data sets that they publish is schools. That's actually really helpful for people who want to, drop school locations on a map. The problem is that every jurisdiction, although it's going to publish the school data, it's going to be slightly different. San Francisco schools, as you can see, is organized slightly different than Cupertino, which is slightly different than Oakland. Although all the information is generally the same, the data sets themselves just don't have a standard. So what this means is, even if Think Data could bring together 3,000 school data sets for a client that wanted national coverage of every school in the US, the client still had 3,000 individual data sets that they needed to work with. So what we started noticing, and what the direction we started going in, is why don't we basically start creating our own standard for working with a client to create a standard, to create an ideal way that the client should and want to adopt this data set and plug it into their own internal data. So we kind of looked at this issue a bit different than I think others have in the past, where we didn't want to develop a standard that we wanted to push onto the individual sources to adopt, because we didn't really see that as a thing that governments were going to be capable of doing. So we said, why don't we sit down with the client and actually understand how they want to adopt the data? So in this particular case, the bottom part of this slide is actually an ideal data set that a client would be interested in. So for a schools data set, they would want name, telephone, and they'd want street number, route, which is the street name, municipality, county, state, country, the geometry, which is the X and Y, and then they'd want the license and the source URL linking back to where the original data point was pulled from. We then would be able to take all the individual pieces of data for schools all across US, all across Canada, all across Europe, wherever, and we'd be able to run it through this standard to generate this ideal schema and data set that the client would then plug into, either download or connect via our API. And we'd keep it constantly updated by all the individual sources that were being published by the various governments or the various jurisdictions that were controlling the original data set. And the really cool thing about this model is we found that every company generally has a different standard internally, so they all need a certain amount of tweaking to the ideal data set that they want to plug into. And that wasn't something that they could communicate to governments or to the various jurisdictions, nor should the governments be listening to a single institution about how to publish their data. So in this particular model, the owners of the data actually just continue to publish the data in the ways that they always have. There is a transformation engine that happens and generates an ideal data set for the client in a way that they actually want to ingest it. and both sides can sort of operate the way they always have, and have the benefit of having their data used and being able to access new data that they haven't in the past. And this is really what we've seen as a huge step forward in open data, because it opens up a lot of opportunity for data scientists within an organization to sit down, brainstorm an ideal way to ingest data, and then receive a feed that matches that exact schema and plug it into whatever they're doing. And that time saver, as well as ability to sort of augment the complexity out of working with public data, really makes it attractive for companies to adopt new sources of external data. So looking at this model, what we really see on a go-forward basis for these clients is as more and more organizations get their own internal data cleaned up, they are looking for new sources of external data that's going to give them a competitive advantage in some sort of capacity. But the solution for this is slightly different than traditional ways of finding, cleaning, and connecting to internal data. And what we really see happening is, because the amount of public data is growing exponentially, organizations are going to have to look at a new way of actually connecting to and bringing this data into their environment. And really, it's an API-based vascular system that connects to the various sources of public data, does the transformations on the fly, and gives them an ideal output, rather than them having to download thousands of different sources of public data, bring it into their environment, do the transformations on top of their own internal data, and then once they get through that mess, actually get an output. So if in this new world of available public data, if you can take all of that complexity outside of the environment and clean it up and provide the organization with a clean data feed that they can plug into their internal environment, we're giving them a way to actually take a really complex issue or a large amount of public data that could be updating 100 different times based on the different sources that are being brought together. We're giving them a clean way to actually plug into that and use it and enrich their own internal data, which we think is the largest value open data is going to play for a lot of big companies. So super high level notes, just to sort of end off the discussion, is what we're seeing is public data is growing exponentially. There's definitely no two ways about it. We're adding hundreds of sources a month to our catalog, which is amazing. Governments are adopting open data like none before them, which is really great. The portals are getting much better, and the data that's being in them is getting more rich, and it's being released in a more standard format, which is really great. Companies that are looking to adopt open data, the thing we always say to them is, regardless, you're going to need a solution to process this data on the fly. Although it may seem manageable to connect to open data in a controlled environment. So if you're looking at just Toronto or just Ontario or potentially even just Canada, it may seem possible to actually connect to all the various data sources and build out a solution yourself. But if you're truly going to scale your business to ingest open data from a large amount of a large country, or something like the US and Canada, North America, or move into a new area like Latin America or Europe, you actually need a solution that's going to manage all those various data feeds, bring them together, drive a standard, and then have that be what you use to ingest public data. Otherwise, the amount of data being published, and the more time that goes by, the more complex this issue gets. It's going to be too much to handle, and that's going to cause serious problems down the line. The other thing we warn against is attempting to tackle this data problem with humans is also not scalable. Although companies may have a really smart data scientist or a really smart developer or a group of developers, ultimately you don't want this to become their full-time job, and I guarantee you it will. We always say to our larger clients, your data scientists, they're scientists, they're not janitors. If you're gonna hire a team of data scientists to solve problems, build out analytics, and run models, enable them to do so. Don't put them into a situation where 80% of their job is going to be focused on cleaning and standardizing and accessing and keeping updated, because really at the end of the day, you're handicapping yourself about what your output could potentially be with working with this data. So if there is a clean way to do it and it's automated, and it makes your data scientist's life a lot easier, it's worth it in the long run, because they're going to be able to focus on what you want them to focus on, which is the high value stuff that only data science can do. And it's also the really sexy stuff that they like to do. So chances are they're going to stick around your organization a lot longer. On that note, I'll end, and I'd love to do Q&A and maybe address some of the issues or points that people on the call are facing.
So I'm just going to switch the window here. Screen share.
Yeah. Oh, that's weird.
Can everyone see the PowerPoint slides now?
I'm still seeing comment section on the PowerPoints, not the actual presentation, if that helps.
Huh. All right, well, that's fine. We don't really need a screen share for this part.
Okay. So I see a few questions here underneath the broadcast. First one is, do you have any stats on how many new businesses have been formed using open data in Canada in the past year?
Sure. Are all these questions for me, I guess?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we can chime in too. But if you have an opinion on that, I'd love to hear it too.
Great. I think so. This is and one of the polling questions I think is sort of to this point as well. New businesses built on open data isn't what we're seeing. It's adoption of open data in existing businesses, and particularly large businesses. So that's where we're seeing exponential growth. And I know that's not the story that I think a lot of local governments would like to hear, which is I think the preferred model there would be government X publishes an open data portal, and 10 startups are born out of the data that's never been previously seen. What we're seeing is that's not necessarily the case. The case is that large companies that actually do have the infrastructure and ability to adopt and ingest external data are the ones who are adopting it. And it is, to a large extent, very large established companies like financial institutions, insurance companies, mapping companies, real estate companies. These are the people who are actually getting the largest advantage to open data. And I think they're the first ones to adopt it for a number of reasons. They have the ability to sort of roll it in. The other thing is startups actually need national or international coverage of a data set in order to roll out a service that is going to be adoptable by users at a scale that's attractive to actually start a business or get investment for a business. And they need the ability to create a barrier of entry, which I think is something that like an individual data set or a group of data sets from an individual section of the country can't provide. So although startups can build really great services on top of a singular data set or a handful of data sets, it's really hard to turn that idea into a sustainable business just because there's no barrier to entry. And every VC or every angel investor that they talk to is going to ask them how they're going to scale globally and how they're going to reach their million user number or whatever the metric is these days. And I think that's something that people have to keep in mind is as open data grows, we're going to see these companies pop up because they're going to be able to launch global, international apps, and those are going to be the ones that are large enough to gain the users to actually start a company. but when we're looking at this regionally, there's a big problem with someone launching a really cool app that does something really great for Guelph, but not being able to expand it beyond that because data is not available in the regions that surround it. So that's sort of why we're seeing larger companies adopt it rather than smaller companies get created. But I foresee that changing over time as more and more data becomes available.
Yeah, I think in spaces where there are standards that are pretty well defined, so transit information is one of them. You've seen a couple successes. I mean, City Mapper is probably one that comes to mind the most, which is a city information and direction application for folks that are using transit, Uber, bike share. And that one works because it's almost a counterpoint to what Brian had said, where there are a large number of cities that publish transport data in a standardized format. And even then, City Mapper works in some places, but it doesn't work in other places. I think the other thing that we've seen some companies try to create indexes on top of open data. And in both cases, whether it's City Mapper building a direction engine or a service that's basically Carfax for your homes that's creating an index on top of crime data for a particular address, they kind of have ways to smooth out the differences in available open data between regions. There is the Open Data 150, which is a project that we've been running at ODX over the past year, but that won't give you, and that is a list of of companies that are using open data, but that won't quite get you the answer that you're looking for, Joseph. And so the next question was from Dana, which was, does ODX have access to global data sets or reciprocal open data agreements with other organizations? So we don't host open data ourselves. As Brian alluded to, the different governments, particularly around Canada, all have their own open data portals. We serve as a front end to try and route people to the right folks in government or the right open data portals that have data sets that might be of use to them. And most of our work has been with Canadian open data, but we do have relationships with other organizations globally that can help you find similar data in different countries. So Dana, I hope that answers that question.
If you have more context about the specific data sets you're looking for, you can just let us know and we can do our best to help you find that. Yeah. The next question is, what are some approaches to pricing open data?
So I think Brian, that's probably for you.
Yeah, I guess so. If it depends, pricing it as in the government pricing it to give it out, or ingesting it and then pricing it to a third party. I'll cover both just because why not? So a company ingesting open data and then selling it. What sort of approaches? I think at the end of the day, every company is going to look for an added service on top of the open data because that's really where the value is going to come in. Collecting open data and then selling it is something that I don't think a lot of people are very interested in looking at, just because there's not enough value that's added to the data itself that that requires requires a price. And I mean, we collect all open data from across Canada and US, and we give it away for free on the platform because, I mean, in the spirit of open data, it is open. We even go as far as to format and provide API access to it. And still we give that away for free, just because I think at the end of the day, the issues that we're seeing with accessing open data isn't just being able to find it and search it. It's the services that you can build on top of it, whether that's enriching it, adding it to a product, and then selling that to the client at the end of the day. I think that's sort of where the value is. For governments that are looking at pricing data feeds, this is something that we generally recommend against, although we do like it better than if they sign a an agreement with a company that's going to sell the data on their behalf, because that makes it impossible to access. I think Ontario is a good example of a few really high value data sets that were basically licensed to singular companies that now sell it for a cost that's completely impossible for anyone to actually access other than publicly traded companies. So pricing at the end of the day isn't terrible, although it's not the best, but it is better than giving those exclusive licenses out.
Thanks, Brian. And Murdad, to your point, so Murdad was asking, was talking about standardization and creating a list of similar fields. So there are a couple of standards organizations that are creating ISO standards for different kinds of open data. And I think Brian alluded to some of that as well. Happy to point you in the direction of some of those. And although the reality is the standard is only as good as getting somebody to adopt it, as you pointed out. The other thing that I'll just mention briefly is there's this notion of data linking in open data sets. You can Google it under link to open data, and that's a specific approach that you take when creating a data set to identify entities in that data set and basically reference some external data set that helps you learn more about that entity. And unfortunately, there's no example that's coming to mind right now, but Murdad, I'm happy to take a look afterwards. So I think, an example of that might be where people are trying to use canonical building addresses across different data sets. So you kind of have a building ID in one data set and you link it to an address in another. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Yeah, I think.
And then Andrew had asked, go ahead, Brian.
This is the standardization of open data sets not possible question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this 100%. And I mean, we share a cartoon in the office, which is one box says, hey, there's 14 different ways to record address. We need a standard. And then the next box is them going away creating a standard, and then they say, "Yay, we created a standard." Now there's 15 different ways to create to record an address point, and I think that's where what we're seeing with open data as well is it's impossible to create a standard and have people adopt it. But our approach to it is we don't need that. As long as people are publishing data and it has key pieces of information in it, the lack of a standard is not really it's not a hurdle we can't get over. It's something we can actually augment out of the process and generate a standard that actually is going to be used by the client, or have a client generate their own standard and adjust it in that particular way. So pushing a standard for organizations to adopt, we actually think is not the right approach, because it's not going to happen. Governments aren't all going to sit down one day and decide to publish things the same way. I mean, even NAICS codes, Canada, US, and Mexico have different ways of recording the North American Standard Code. So if something as easy as that is something that can't be standardized, there's absolutely no way we're going to see, every municipality sit down and start recording their municipal school data sets the same way. But as long as they're publishing the data sets with the right information in it, or close to the right information in it, and we can augment that standardization process out of these individual data sets, then I think that's an approach that's actually scalable and one that can solve the problem. And like I said earlier, even if there was a standard, every client or every person who's looking to ingest it is going to want that standard slightly different, because they all have their own internal standards. Like if you go to, we work with a bunch of the banks, and if you go to RBC compared to Scotiabank compared to BMO, they all simply have a different standard internally on how they categorize information. So if in the perfect world, every government sat down and built a standard on how to release business directory information, it still wouldn't be standard enough for these organizations to plug directly into it. It would be much better than it currently is, but it still wouldn't be the exact way that each of them individually need it. So our whole approach to standardization is take it out of the equation. Just make sure governments are publishing the data and tell them which data they need to publish. But that standardization issue can take place outside of the organizations themselves. And we think that's sort of the way that this open data, how open data has to move forward.
And I'm just going to jump to the chat here. Andrew has a question. He says, Have you considered publishing a corpus of potential data sets to make integration from new open data initiatives easier to integrate?
So, Andrew, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Brian, do you?
I think we, we've shared a list of open data sets that we think every municipality should be releasing based on organizations that are using them. A lot of companies that are on the Open Data 150. There's about 100 data sets that every municipality across Canada and the US is publishing as a whole. But it's a really good list because it creates sort of like a base layer catalog or a baseline catalog that is high value data and it's low hanging fruit. So I think if I'm interpreting the question correctly, sharing that more publicly would be a great place to start, but I could be misinterpreting the question.
And there's another question here from Martin. I've been working with several government bodies, and the biggest hurdle I'm finding is the lack of technical support. It seems their model is more self-server. Do you see an appetite for developing support centers for open data?
Yeah, I think, one of the questions that we get, or one of the pushbacks we get a lot from government is not having the either technical ability or budget to actually launch an open data initiative. At this point, Esri is giving away their open data portal for free, and most governments already have Esri. It's tough to make the argument that the budget's not there to adopt a free software for something that you already have integrated throughout your organization, especially on the geospatial front, which is where most of the initial data sets come from. And with that comes technical support as well. I know that's not a great answer because it is sort of a provider, but if all governments not having open data portals, we're just publishing lists of links of data sets that you could download on an HTML page somewhere, that would still be more useful than not publishing the data at all. And I think the technical skill set and budget required to copy and paste a bunch of links on a page that link to a download button are not as big as a hurdle as a lot of people think. As far as support for governments to publish data or give them a platform, I think over the past 2 years we've seen like a significant shift in the marketplace. Back when we started the company, like Socrata was really the only company out there, and I know their product was expensive, and a lot of organizations looked at it and said, we don't know if open data is worth $100,000 a year or whatever it was. Which is fair. And the only other option was CCAN, which was the open source solution where you had to have technical expertise internally to actually launch. But over the past 2 years, we've seen a pretty significant shift in the market. I think Socrata is more or less pulled completely out of Canada and everywhere except the US. CCAN's gotten a lot more interesting. There's a lot of companies that will spin up CCAN solutions for free for government so that they have the ability to adopt their other solutions like financial dashboards and stuff. And Esri's come along with their open data portal as well, which makes publishing open data, it's like a toggle on the back end that actually launches the portal. And we're seeing governments all across the US on a monthly basis launch Esri portals like it's nobody's business. It's growing like crazy, and it's because they're giving it away for free and it's fully integrated with the software they already have. So I think this problem's getting figured out as we continue to go down the path of available open data.
Martin, just to clarify, did you mean getting technical support with the data set itself, like explanations on the fields and data that looks incorrect? Okay, so Brian probably has some too, but we've got a bunch of different relationships with different governments that supply open data. So in some cases, they have help email addresses on the open data portal, but in other cases, they don't, or it's the wrong email address. So, I think there's always a bit of back and forth, but if you've got the wrong person, sometimes it's a question of getting the right person to answer the question. And the person that understands the content of the data set isn't always the person that's running the open data portal for the city or for the level of government. So it's it's definitely not an ideal situation, and it kind of comes out of this culture that we sometimes see where people are just like, we just want to release open data. Like we just want to count the data sets that are released for our government, which is kind of a ridiculous metric. So, you can reach out to me offline and we can kind of help you. But yeah, I agree. Every government has its own process or complete lack thereof. And we, as kind of arm's length, we suffer from that same problem as well. But feel free to reach out to me and we can see if there's something we can do on those specific requests.
Yeah, sorry, Martin, I completely interpreted your question wrong. Apologies.
I think that's all the questions we have now. If anyone has any other questions, they can leave it here in the chat. We'll make sure that it gets to Brian or Joseph. Or you can feel free to tweet at Brian or Joseph. I'll send an email after this webinar is finished with their Twitter handles so you can get in touch with them. And it looks like there's a few people that wanted a link to this webinar so they could rewatch it. So you can actually rewatch it in the same link once we're done with the broadcast, but I'll again send that link out as well. And we will also have it available on our YouTube channel, but that takes a little bit of time to edit. So I'll send you the link when it's ready. I wanted to mention, if you are interested in staying up to date with open data and what's happening in Canada and in the States and internationally, we are a subscriber of this newsletter called the Open Government Digest, and it's really great for keeping you up to date. Joseph's just going to type the link in the chat bar for you since our PowerPoint isn't working. But we found it really helpful to stay up to date with what's going on. And it's a bi-weekly email, so you get it twice a month. And I'll send the link as well in an email so that you can sign up if you're interested. And I think Joseph already talked about the OD 150, but if you're interested, if you use open data at your company and you're interested in being part of the list, we'll send you the link for that survey that you can fill out and help us gather the data. We have a lot of respondents in Ontario and Quebec, and we'd like to see some respondents across the other provinces. And lastly, if you want to keep in touch with us and find out more about the next webinar that we're going to be hosting, it'll be in January. The date is unconfirmed. I think it might be January 3rd, but I will follow up with you then. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube, as I said. And if you're interested, I will send you the information on the next webinar, which is going to be with Simon. Yeah.
Well, we're really sorry that the ODX slides didn't work, but it's good that Brian's did, because those are the important ones. And thank you very much for your time today, and have a great week, and please do reach out if you've got questions. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, everyone.